So we're going to continue to talk in Chapter 6, and I continue to figure out what's going on with that access code. Just by showing hands, how many folks are still having trouble getting to the ebook? We still have a couple folks, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to, I'll tell you what let's do. If you're still having trouble getting on the ebook, if you don't mind, send me an email today, just kind of what the problem is, so I can, in my conversations with them, I can try to describe it as best I can. And I really apologize. This is the most inexpensive way to get to our textbook, this ebook. But, you know, the downside of it is dealing with all this technology stuff. So I appreciate your patience. Bear with me. And we'll hopefully get this sorted out soon. In the meantime, as you know, we will have pop quizzes here and there. As long as you're familiar with our notes that we've been looking at coming into the class, and then any readings for that class, you should be in pretty good shape, okay? All right, awesome. So we are going to have our paper discussion today. How many of y'all were able to access that paper okay? Because I know, so I'm thinking what I may actually do is push. I think I'm going to push that discussion back one day, just because I know several folks tried to access it and it was behind a paywall there, a subscription wall. So let's actually go ahead and we're going to push that discussion back to next class. So there's an article on essentially like solving the tragedy of the commons, which we're going to talk about, and I think that'll fit better with next class anyway. How to solve the tragedy of the commons, both with some pioneering work done by a Nobel Prize winning economist, and then also with a kind of neat example at the grassroots level in Mexico. So let's be sure and have those read for next class. Maybe just write yourself a note, and I'll send out an email reminder. Let's just do that for next class to make sure we're all ready to chat about that. Okay. So this is the part of the class where we're touching on some kind of broad issues before we go into specifics of how our environment works, just to provide some context. And I think the article from last class provides context that we're going to want to keep in our mind throughout this class. That is, how do issues of equity affect these environmental issues that we talk about? Because experiences differ, right, in our country and around the world, depending on what group of people you belong to, however you define that. But we also need to talk about economics a little bit here and talk about kind of how that affects our perception and our generation of these environmental issues. So I think it's good to start with a little bit of definition. What's the definition of an economy that some of y'all may have heard? Any thoughts? Way to trade?
Monetary values and incentives.
Monetary values and incentives? Mm-hmm. Cool. So like a lot of terms, we can define it differently based on what we're doing with it, right? But the way your book breaks it down, and the way that it makes the most sense kind of for our class, is the thing about economics is actually a social system. And we participate in the social system, of course, whenever we purchase something, right? It's an interaction that isn't just monetary, right? It's between different people. So it's a social system that converts resources into goods and services. And again, that looks all different ways depending on the goods and services that we're discussing. And so if that's an economy, economics is the study of that social system, right? So economics is the study of people. It's a social science, right? If you're an economist, you're a social scientist. It's a study of how we decide to use resources, which for most of us are scarce to one degree or another. A study of how people decide to use those resources to provide goods and services that are in demand. Any questions, comments, or thoughts on those definitions? If we have any econ majors in the room, feel free to correct me at any moment. I am not an economist by any stretch of the imagination, nor do I play one on TV. You ever see those advertisements for medicine? That was one of the crazy things. When I came back from Nepal and India, so I was over there for 5 years in the Peace Corps in the mid-90s, and when I left, you never had ads for prescription drugs on TV. And I came back and I was like, what's going on? Like all these like ads for prescription drugs on TV, like that's strange. Like didn't like my doctor know like what I need? But you ever see those ads where they're like, not a doctor, but I play one on TV. And I'm here to tell you about this. So I'm not an economist, nor do I play one on TV. So my understanding of this is that of an environmental scientist. All right, so we got the social system, turning resources into goods and services, and we study and see how people do that, how people go about doing that. Now, the prevailing paradigm of economics that we deal with in our society, the model that our society generally accepts is what's known as neoclassical economics. Now, y'all could take Dr. Leah Graydon Matthews' course on environmental economics and learn some amazing things about different economic systems, how they interact with the environment. But we're going to talk about neoclassical economics because that's really the dominant paradigm. So the idea behind neoclassical economics is this balance between supply and demand. That when demand is great, supply will naturally increase to meet that demand. On the other hand, when demand is less, supply will either meet that or the value of that supply will decline. And again, your book goes into this in more detail. I'm not really going to for our purposes, but there's definitely more to it. But the main idea here is that there's an equilibrium. When we talk about any good and service, it could be timber production. It could be Cabbage Patch dolls. Do they still sell Cabbage Patch dolls? Does anybody? You guys, when I was younger, Cabbage Patch dolls. There were these dolls. They're not even. They're kind of like ugly looking to me. They're creepy. In my humble opinion, they sort of freak me out. Everybody needed a Cabbage Patch doll. It was crazy. People were like getting into fistfights over Cabbage Patch dolls. There was like the demand for Cabbage Patch. It was crazy, guys. It was scary. It was a scary thing. So the demand for Cabbage Patch dolls way, way high. And so, of course, Cabbage Patch. It's kind of a weird thing to think of dolls wearing a Cabbage Patch. But anyway, there were lots and lots of dolls produced. And so sometimes we see these crazy things. When I was in India several years back visiting where my wife is from, one of the new iPhones had just come out. And they had, maybe it was the BBC we were watching, and they had the videos of like the Apple store, right? Like crazy, like lines way out the window, and they're like, "What? Like it's a cell phone, right?" I'm like, yeah, it's a cell phone. What's so amazing about it? Well, I don't know. It's got a new camera. It's got like, I don't even have an iPhone. Like, what does the new iPhone have that the other one didn't have? It was like a camera that takes pictures in the dark or something. I don't know what it has. But this demand is created, right? And so when that demand is created, like all the iPhones come, all the Cabbage Patch Kids come. Cabbage Patch Kids with their iPhones. So this is the idea of neoclassical economics. There's this balance between supply and demand. So neoclassical economics has 5 assumptions, right? So for this balance to occur, which it relies on, there are 5 things that need to be the case. Anybody happen to know what any of them are? Any neoclassical economists in the room? Economic student? Why is that word so hard for me to say? I don't know. So 5 assumptions, and we're going to look at each of these and maybe just think for a moment about how they apply to the environment. So the first assumption, that people behave rationally. Right. We're laughing already, right? And that they have access to full information. So the idea behind like people, I'll find a picture of a Cabbage Patch Kid for next time. It may haunt your dreams, but you just have to see it. How many people know what Cabbage Patch dolls are? Do you? Okay.
I've had them.
It's okay. You can own it. Like it's all right if you still have them. That's completely fine. So you guys probably all know what these are, and they probably haven't changed. So the idea is that people's demand for Cabbage Patch Kids is rational, and they have access to full information. So the idea is that if you're going to buy a doll for your daughter or your son, don't want to be biased here, that you've looked at all the different dolls that are out there, and you've looked at their strengths and weaknesses, the advantages and disadvantages of each. And after weighing out all of that, you've decided that, like, Cabbage Patch Kid is what we need. Well, what are some other reasons that you want a Cabbage Patch Kid, besides looking at all the costs and benefits and pros and cons of each one? Oh, you have pictures of Cabbage Patch Kids. Oh dear, not quite. They do look a little different. No, the face is the same. It's kind of a half smile. It almost looks, well, anyway, I'll get a picture for next time. Maybe we'll have a Cabbage Patch Kid give us a quiz or something. What are some things reasons we buy things besides, like, an unbiased evaluation of their pros and cons? Other people have it. Yep. Status, yeah. Other people have it, right? It kind of takes on like a social identity of its own. Yeah. So anyway, so for this cost and benefit, like nobody could have predicted that like everyone would need a Cabbage Patch Kid that one. Just kind of great. But so anyway, so this is one of the ideas of this balance. Now this has to do a little more with meeting the demand. So we think of the resources that are needed to make Cabbage Patch Kid dolls. I had no idea we were going to talk about Cabbage Patch Kid dolls today when I walked into this room. It just happened. Sorry about that. Really, I am. But if you're making a Cabbage Patch Kid doll, they're cloth. Is the face like cloth or plastic? I can't remember.
I'm pretty sure the face is plastic and the hair is cloth, or like yarn.
Yarn. Okay. So we're going to need plastic to make it. So where does plastic come from? The plastic store. Well, is there a plastic store? Anybody know? Yeah, synthetic. So we can make it in the lab, but where it comes from predominantly is from petroleum products, right? That's where plastic comes from. So we're going to need petroleum for the plastic for the face of these dolls. If the yarn, what is yarn made out of? Is it like cotton? This is what happens when I come up with examples I haven't thought of. I have no answers to all my own questions. Is yarn is made out of cotton, maybe? Or acrylic? Okay. So yeah, polyester. So if it's cotton, then that's a crop that has to be grown out of the ground. If it's acrylic, it's synthesized in a lab, and so we have to think about where those chemicals come from. All right. So when people think about how many Cabbage Patch dolls are going to be made that year, they probably weren't thinking about like, how much cotton do we have, how much petroleum we have to throw, this kind of thing. They just kind of thought about like how many are people going to buy. So the assumption is that like all the resources are there to meet whatever the demand is. Talk more about this in a second. Third is that the cost and benefits are internal. And we're talking about transactions. So if I go, if I'm evaluating 3 different Cabbage Patch Kids to buy, and I don't know, are they all the same price, Cabbage Patch Kids? Are there different costs of Cabbage Patch Kids? I'm so glad we have a couple people that know something about them now. Because otherwise, I would have always been. Is it the same price for all the different Cabbage Patch Kids? Yeah, maybe, I don't know. Well, just imagine that we had Cabbage Patch Kids that cost different amounts. And so the idea about the cost and benefits being internal, all included in the transaction, is that if I pay for the more expensive Cabbage Patch Kid, are they? Okay.
You got one, like the cheapest one I'm seeing is 80, the most expensive is about 1,500. You got one that's sitting at under 1,000.
$1,500 Cabbage Patch Kid, man. Right on. That's probably like the 80-something version, because everyone is going crazy over it. So the idea of this being, these costs and benefits being internal, is that if I'm paying more for that Cabbage Patch Kid, the cost is all contained in that Cabbage Patch Kid. So like maybe its hair is made out of silk. Maybe it's, maybe it's clothes or like designed by some fashion designer. The idea is that when things are more expensive, like it's because it costs more to produce that, for that to come along. Question?
If you like a carbon tax, certainly something has to pay to sustainable, like where they aren't including as much, and that price of it for the consumer.
So, we'll talk about this either today or next class. Things like carbon taxes, things like that, are ways to try and put the cost and benefits into the transaction when something is cheaper than it should be. So we'll talk about what kinds of costs and benefits aren't internal. But the neoclassical economic model assumes that when something is cheaper, essentially the person who's selling it and the person who's buying it are representing that cost equally. Like, rewind. Let me put it this way: that the cost of a product is represented in its price. So when something is more expensive, it costs more to produce. When something is cheaper, the overall cost of producing it is lower, and that is the cost to everyone. Just
answer my question.
Okay, probably very poorly. I think I'm going to go through an example, which hopefully will help. Cool. Another assumption is that future effects should be discounted. So if you have, you can buy a Cabbage Patch Kid now or buy a certificate that will give you a Cabbage Patch Kid in a year. And the idea is that you should pay less for the certificate that gives you the Cabbage Patch Kid in a year. And then finally, one of the assumptions that kind of underlies this paradigm is that growth is good, because it means that value is being built, that as the whole sum total of all the goods and services that are produced increase, that's a good thing for all of us, right? That we all benefit when that's the case. So I'm curious, we talked the other day about how ultimately everything that we consume ultimately comes from the environment, right? The desks and the minerals in them, the fibers in our clothes, the food that we eat, all comes from the environment. When we think about any of these assumptions here, which might not make sense in light of the fact that we need resources for everything we construct, and we have to dispose of waste for almost everything we produce as well. Any of these that you're feeling a little squirrely about in light of that? Yeah, sorry, just yell at me if I don't hear your hand up.
For the last one, growth is good. Speaking like expansion of the factories on it.
So expansion of the economy. So if we were to talk about, for instance, the gross domestic product, right, which is like the grand total of all the goods and services produced by a country in a given time period, right? That as that goes up and up and up and up, that's good. And that it's interesting, we're in an election. Like, what's the economy doing? Which candidate is going to be better for the economy? And better is almost always thought of as like leading to more economic growth, right? Or at least that's the way I often hear it talked about. But it's interesting to think about it, that we're on a finite planet. I mean, we haven't started mining other planets and moons for resources yet. And so as our economy grows and grows and grows and grows and grows, on that same Earth, maybe at some point we get to a point where we're getting toward the limit of Earth to produce. Something about it. And then number 2 as well, right? This idea that resources are infinite or substitutable. You know, we have started producing a lot of fuel from corn by making ethanol from corn. And on the one hand, it's a really good thing because it means that we're not using as much fossil fuels. You might have come up to the gas station, this thing that says like fuel may contain up to 10% ethanol or something like that, right? So it's cool, less fossil fuel that we're using. But what else do we use corn for besides like making fuel for our cars? We eat it. And so when you look at prices for corn, they've been going up and up and up because we don't have an infinite ability to grow corn. We can grow a lot of it. Go to Iowa, we can grow a lot of corn, but it's not completely infinite. And so we start to see that these assumptions, some of them fit better than others. On the corn question, so I grew up in like western New York State, and my parents were both from the Midwest, Kansas and Nebraska. I never go off on tangents, in case you've realized that already. I never do that. And so like we drive out there to visit family around the holidays, and like we'd start driving at like, I don't know, 7 or 8 o'clock at night and just start driving west. And we'd drive through nonstop. I don't know, because we were crazy probably. But so like in the morning, the sun would begin to rise, and we were in Iowa. And I would wake up and I'd be like, wait, am I wearing like gold-colored glasses? Like, what exactly is happening here? And like, corn's everywhere, right? Like crazy, everywhere. And so I might think from that, well, corn is infinite, or close to it. But when we see costs of corn going up, as our demand goes up and up, maybe that's something to do with resource availability and supply not being able to meet that demand. All right. So let's think about how the environment interacts with economies. So one way to think of economics is with sort of 2 compartments. So over here we've got agriculture, industry, and business. And here we've got households, right? And we've got 2 different kinds of flow going in both directions. So on the one hand, we've got households, right? And so they provide labor to agriculture, industry, and business, and then of course receive wages in return. And the same households purchase goods and services from agriculture, industry, and business, and pay for those, right? So we've got this flow of capital in the form of wages this way, and in the form of payment for products this way. And then on the production side, we have a flow of labor from households to ag, industry, and business. And then in products, back the other way. So this is sort of like the neoclassical model, right? The idea that production is always going to match up with demand. So where's the environment in this model? Like how does the environment interact with this model? Any thoughts? Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, right? So, so the environment provides resources. It might provide limits. How much area can we put into agriculture? So let's take a little bit larger view. And I might just add, this is figure 6.9 in your book. The newest edition, it may be possibly a different figure, but the same book is there. Same figure is there. Okay, so we'll take this model, and then let's think about it in the context of our environment. So there's a couple things, a couple flows that we want to be aware of that affect how the environment interacts with our economy. One important one is recycling. Are they recycling in the dorms right now? Is that all? Is that happening?
Yeah, but they do understand, you know, really.
I
But
think it's like the outside of the state,
Okay, cool, cool. Yeah, yeah. Anyway, that's good. That's what going on. Awesome. So recycling is super cool because on the one hand, it allows, it allows raw materials to be put back over here. So if you can melt down the glass and use it again, you don't have to extract the silica and all that stuff to make more glass. So we can reduce the amount of goods and services moving this way by recycling, right? And reduce the amount of resources. We'll see in a second. All right, so think of this as like a flow. So on the upstream side, we've got natural resources. So again, this is the wood, this is the clean water, these are the minerals, these are the agricultural products, all those things, right? The nutrients that we're growing stuff. So we've got natural resources on the downstream side, which feed into the economy. So it's kind of flowing this way, left to right. And the more we recycle, of course, the less dependent we are for new natural resources to constantly become energy. That's a good thing. On the other side, if we keep going downstream, no pun intended, well, maybe pun intended, then what we see is that we generate waste in this process. And so the more goods and services are produced, the more waste that's also generated. And water pollution, just solid waste generation. And so in the same way that we rely on the environment to produce the resources that our economy needs, we also rely on the environment to accept the waste that our economy produces, right? And we might think that that wouldn't be a limit, right? We might think that as much waste as we produce. Somebody told me once that we should never teach our kids the term throw away. Because it doesn't disappear, right? It's not like it vaporizes. It goes to the landfill, or maybe it goes to the recycling facility. But it goes somewhere. And as landfills get full of trash, they get covered over. And we dig another hole in the ground, and we start filling that up with our trash. Cover that over. We dig another hole, start filling up, right? So at some point we hit a limit. When I was young, there was an incident that happened. New York City had capped a landfill recently. And there was this barge full of trash. I think it was maybe coming from Queens. I can't remember. But it couldn't go to the landfill that it normally went to. So that barge started going south. And they were looking for some place to dump that trash. And it actually came to North Carolina. It was going to be docking at Morehead City. And the reporters got wind of it, because by now people knew about this. It was this huge barge full of trash. And it was coming to Morehead City. And they were going to bring it in, of course, in the middle of the night, right? Surprise, surprise. So they were going to bring it. So reporters were there with like big floodlights and everything, like to capture this. And then, of course, at that point, like the governor was like, no, not going to happen in North Carolina. Kept going south. This trash barge kept going south. Then they thought they'd take it to Mexico. And when it came into Mexican waters, Mexican military boats came and met it and forced it to turn around and go back the other way. And so it ended up going back and disposing of that waste in New York State. So I don't know. It's just an example showing that, we don't have a limitless ability to accept it. All right, well, you can notice there's still a couple parts of the environment's interaction with the economy that we haven't highlighted yet. But let me ask you, in nature, what happens to waste products in nature? In some ways, like the leaves that fall off of our deciduous trees in the fall are kind of like waste products in a way, right? It's like the waste, like the end result of all that autochthonous production that we'll talk about later. What happens to all those leaves? Yeah, they break down, they decompose. So in nature, what happens? Oh, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. We'll talk about that. So in nature, what happens to this waste is that it's recycled. You've got all these insects that break it down. And those insects, maybe they're eaten by birds. Maybe they decompose. They turn those nutrients loose in the soil, and so we can grow things. In our house, food scraps that we don't eat, we save and we compost them. So they decompose, and we take those and put them in our garden, and it helps us grow more food the next year. We're doing great, like keeping our garden watered and everything, and then like classes and jobs started up again, and we're like, oh my gosh, I hope we don't like kill all of our plants now. Anyway, so nature also takes all of this waste and will cycle it back. It'll break it down. It'll turn it back into nutrients. If it's polluted water, we have wetlands and things that water would naturally flow through, and the sediment would settle out, and plants would take up the excess nutrients. And nature has an amazing way of taking this waste, if we dispose of it right, and bringing it back here. Now we'll talk later on about what kinds of waste nature can't do anything with, but naturally nature can cycle some of this back. And that's why landfills, after they're capped, they often settle down. Because the organic matter in there is getting broken down, whether it's bacteria and whatever else, it's breaking that stuff down. Now, it's not breaking down the plastic and the metal, that kind of stuff, but the organic matter gets broken down. All right, so nature is like recycling the waste and turning it back into natural resources, which again can feed our economy. All right, and then the last piece on top here are what are called ecosystem services. We'll talk more about these in just a minute, but essentially ecosystem services are things that ecosystems do that allow our economy to run, that they do for free, right? It's nothing that we have to pay to do. It's things that nature takes care of automatically. You could argue that decomposition of nutrients is an ecosystem service. We got a picture of a bee here. Why might there be a picture of a bee on a flower talking about ecosystem services? Right. They pollinate the crops, right? So most of the crops that we grow are flowering plants. And so you need the pollen to get from the male of one plant to the male flower of one plant to the female flower of another, to fertilize it and to grow into an orange, a tomato, a bean, whatever it is. And so these insects do that for free. So when a farmer goes and plants a whole bunch of tomatoes, the farmer doesn't have to go and like individually move the pollen from one flower to another, because the insects all come in and they do that. And if they didn't do that, it would cost us a bunch. And there are some plants that are ancient plants that don't have natural pollinators now, that when people grow them, they have to use little brushes, little pollen brushes to transfer pollen from one flower to another. So much of our food is produced by pollinators naturally. So that's something that we don't pay for at all. But if it stopped happening, we would. So other examples, recreation. You know, the real estate market is interesting sometimes to think about what people value. And we know that houses that have a view of the mountains sell for the same house that doesn't have a view of the mountains. Sell for more than the same house. Homes and property that have a stream on them sell for more than homes that don't. So these are things that people value. You know, why do people flock to, Western North Carolina in the fall in their cars and drive really slow on the Blue Ridge Parkway? What are people coming to do in the fall in the Blue Ridge? Look at the leaves. Yeah, people come because it's a part of nature that people enjoy. And if we had cities, farms, whatever, all along the parkway, instead of the beautiful forest that we do, we wouldn't have that big economic influx every fall. Some people would be like, that's not me. But I don't know, man. All the art galleries and restaurants that got in Asheville, it'd be hard to support those without lots of tourists. Anywho, these ecosystem services, these are things that nature provides for our economy that we don't have to pay for at all. Now, you might argue that in some ways we pay for them on the parkway by not farming or something in those areas, and there's some merit to that. But they've done studies to see how much people would be willing to pay to keep those areas forested, and it's more than we would gain if we were to farm that land. So it's interesting to confirm. Any questions or comments? Questions on thoughts on this kind of take on the economy and how it relates to the environment? All right. So the idea is that we take kind of a conventional view of economics based on the more neoclassical model. And then we start integrating it with the environment and all these different places. And what we see is that the environment does have a pretty big role. Cool. So one of the issues that we have in environmental economics is the issue of value. We tend to value things by how much we're willing to pay for them. That works great for a lot of things. What are some things that nature produces that we pay for, like directly? Any thoughts? Some examples of market value. So these are non-market values. What are some things from nature that we can find a very clear market for and say how much they're worth? Say it again?
Air, like the trees and like open air quality.
So I guess, yeah, so the example of clean air was raised. And that's one that you can generate a value for, but I guess I was thinking of things even simpler, like something that you can go to the market and buy.
Like brown.
Say again? Yeah, something that we literally like. Wait, did you say raw honey? Oh, I thought you said raw money. I'm like, yeah, there's a value for raw money. Yeah, exactly. So honey, for sure. We can look at how much it costs in the store and see about it. So there are things with market value. The problem is things that don't have, things that you can't go and buy, but that are valuable, they're kind of valueless. Can we think of some examples of non-market values where they're not necessarily included in how much we pay for something? What are some things that nature provides for us that are maybe a little harder to value because they're not something you can go to Amazon and find how much it costs? So yeah, so we mentioned a couple of words of pollination and ecosystem services. Yeah, that's kind of a broad one. And there's even some, but there's some even besides ecosystem services too. Don't worry, I got lots of them. So in addition to ecosystem services, think about these. Think about existence value. Do we think there's, and you don't have to write all these down, I'm just giving some examples. So do we think there's value to, the Bengal tiger existing? Do we think that's a good thing? Maybe so, but how do we decide how much it's worth? It's a lot harder thing to do. Scientific value. Maybe we can learn something about how our ecosystem works by having all the species there. How much is that worth? Aesthetic values, again, the Blue Ridge Parkway or the Grand Canyon. How much is it worth to us just to have a place like the Grand Canyon that we can go visit? And it's amazing, right? It just takes your breath away. How do we put a value on that? Use values, right? If we're rock climbers or hikers or whatever, how much are we willing to pay to have places in nature that we can practice those activities? And then, of course, cultural values as well. When we have folks from different cultural backgrounds, and some of those backgrounds might put a high value on a species or an ecosystem for religious purposes, for instance. We did a research project on the sicklefin redworth, which is a species of fish that is found in the Oconaluskie River down in Cherokee, and it's a species that was very important. It was captured, and there were these foods that were made from them at a certain time of year when they would make their spawning migration. But now there's a dam on the Oconaluskie River, and so the fish can't get up to the areas where they could before. And so we wanted to study if these fish were reintroduced, could they survive in this upstream area? And one of the take-home messages was, unfortunately, probably not, because several of them went down over the dam and downstream. So, so certain parts of nature can be real important for different cultural values as well. So all of these values of nature there's no market for them. Again, you can't look them up on Amazon or whatever. And so we have to think about, like, when we're valuing nature, how do we incorporate these things? And it's not an easy thing to do. We're going to talk a lot about ecosystem services, and we already have today. And so to give it a definition then, we're going to call these essential services that support, the phrase strangely. These essential services support the life that makes economic activities possible. So again, like nutrient processing, pollination. Can we think of any other examples of ecosystem services?
Like water and land that is in
That's an interesting one. So that one, like, we could, we haven't talked about it, but like there are ways that you could like calculate the value of that, like how many kilowatt hours you could generate. So that one would be kind of more in, we didn't talk about that, but that would be an example of these things called option value. That like we have the option to dam up that river and generate power. But yeah, it's kind of the gray area. So that's kind of in between. Good example.
these scientists values look at like if they have any medicinal value, like for drugs like aloe vera, for example.
Yeah, and right. So you both have brought up interesting examples of things that that we can't look up on Amazon, but that are sort of like they have a price eventually. So ecosystem services most strictly are things that support like life in addition to humans. So like electricity, really only we need them, but it's very important. Something with these drugs. So that would kind of be more. That would probably come under these like scientific values. So we generally think of sort of things that humans don't have to like engage in to bring about, you know? Things that we have to get involved in to bring about are these ideas of option values, which we haven't talked a whole lot about, but Dr. Matthews has talked about it in environmental economics before. Yeah. So yeah, maintenance of clean water, like that lots of species need, could be absolutely. So I think you kind of get the idea. So water purification, and again, you don't have to write all these down, but just sort of know what sorts of things we're talking about here. So water purification, again, nature takes sediment out of the water, takes nutrients out of the water, all these kinds of things. So these are all just sort of the processes that that the economy needs, but that we, you know, we can't look up like how much is it worth to form like 100 grams of soil, right? Like there's no, can't look that up. Yeah, climate regulation as well. One thing we're learning is that we get a lot more climate extremes in big cities, particularly with regard to heat, right? So when we think about regulating our climate, which is an issue now more and more, that's another thing that trees and things like that do really well. So what are some of the ways that economic activities affect the environment?
Producing agriculture, you have to take them to the ocean and use that
Yeah, so what we talk about, like, what they call monocultures. If you grow one particular crop, right? It takes a lot of certain nutrients out of the soil and can deplete those over time. So when, as we thinking through this, really the two simplest ways are upstream and downstream. So relative to our economies, that natural resources are depleted, or that too much pollution is produced. And that as those things happen, then we can see nature's ability to fulfill these ecosystem services decline to a certain extent. You've probably heard that we're concerned about declines in honeybee populations, for instance. And they think that this is primarily due to a group of chemicals that we spray on our crops to kill off agricultural pest insects, a group of chemicals called neonicotinoids, which are related to nicotine, and then those really seem to be affecting honeybees. So, so our activities in this case for agriculture production are negatively impacting ecosystem services. Any thoughts or questions so far? I appreciate all the examples you all are bringing out. Cool. All right, let's see. How are we doing on our time? Good. I realize this is kind of a long lecture period, so if you have to do a stretch every now and then or whatever, I totally understand. So, a lot of what environmental economists are trying to do is to put value on those non-market values. Because when we make decisions about where do we cut down a forest, how do we develop, we can think pretty clearly about a cost and benefit analysis for things that have market values. But for things that don't have market values, it's very hard. And the risk is that if we don't account for those market values, if we don't account for those non-market values, they're going to go away, right? If we're not able to show a benefit for them, then they're going to go away, right? In the process of be it agriculture, be it urban development, whatever it is, those are going to go away. I just want to share a little example of a way that economists have tried to quantify these, to put value on. This is what's called payment for ecosystem services. And so the idea here is that the people who have the decision to affect these ecosystems or not to be compensated for maintaining those ecosystem services. And that the folks who should compensate them for that are the folks that rely on those ecosystem services. So, it's a way of trying to essentially turn a non-market value into essentially a market value, right? by deciding like how much one should pay. And so one example is with regards to clean water. We're really fortunate here in Asheville. Does anybody know where most of our water comes from here in Asheville? Say it again? Yeah, indirectly. So we have a couple reservoirs, a couple lakes up near the Blue Ridge Parkway. We have Beachy Reservoir and North Fork Reservoir. North Fork is on the North Fork of the Swananoa River. Beachy Reservoir is on a little creek called Beachy Creek, which my stream ecology class is actually studying. Yeah, and so we have these lakes and these forested watersheds, and we get our water from there, and it's really good. It might taste a little funky due to chlorine or whatever, but it's really good. Well, in Costa Rica, there is this situation where they get their water from these lakes, but upstream, the water that flows into these lakes, there's a lot of farming that goes on. And so, as you might imagine, well, maybe let's think about this. If you have a lake, when it rains, and there's forests all around it, that water is going to move into the ground, and it's going to move slowly into the lake. But what happens if we were to, say, take a lot of those trees off the landscape? What's going to happen then to the water when it comes into that watershed? You don't know what a watershed is? A watershed is just all the area that drains the water down to one particular point. So it's all the land that water falls in and it flows down to this lake. So if we go, say we go off the Parkway in Asheville, and we remove a lot of the trees that are around that lake. Now, what's going to happen to the water now when it falls near that lake? Yeah, we're going to have a lot more erosion. We're going to have, we're not going to have trees with big root systems to hold the soil together, so the water's going to carry that soil into our lake. We're not going to have as much water percolating down into the ground because we don't have all the plants that slow the flow of that water. So when we take the trees off the landscape, the quality of water in that lake is going to go down. So here in Costa Rica, there are these farmers that own the land upstream from the lake where they drew their water from. And so the utility company said, we're going to pay these farmers a certain amount of money not to cut down the trees right down to the edge of this lake. And to manage this land in a way that will ensure a clean water supply. So the way they did this was by adding a tax under the bill for the people that took that clean water, and then that money went to the upstream farmers. So PES, Payment for Ecosystem Services. So this is an attempt then to try and preserve these non-market values by putting a price on them. And so, yeah, so the net result of this program was that it led to more forested cover on this land, and so that means that that there'll be clean water for everyone. So I don't know. This has its pros and cons. Could anybody think of a potential? So this is one way you could go about trying to solve this problem, right? Of declining water quality in that lake. Can we think of a potential downside to this approach? Any thoughts? Right. So that's one potential downside is number one, people might not want to pay as much. And number two, you got to get that just right? Because if you make that too high, people are going to say, they're going to protest or whatever else. They might try to get their water somewhere else. So one key to this whole thing working is kind of calibrating the amount. Yeah, because if it's too high, the consumer is going to get mad. If it's too low, what's going to happen? Yeah, people are going to be like, well, that's not, they're not paying me as much as I would get from cutting these trees and like selling the timber. So that's a challenge, is calibrating this. So. Yeah. So anyway, some other folks say like it's a problem too because like ultimately we would like people to take into consideration these non-market values. And if we just simply say, well, like we're going to try to like put a cost on like everything, then like that could be really challenging. So this still doesn't like encourage people to think about the value of like a tiger or, you know, being able to climb a rock. Like it's a slippery slope when you're still using dollars and cents to value everything. So I don't know. Some folks say that like that this just sort of like puts off the problem. Like we still have like no matter how much we quantify all of these like non-market values, there's still going to be some non-market values out there that we haven't been able to put a dollar figure on, and those ones are still going to go away. So you know, I feel like it's the step in the right direction, but certainly not perfect. Okay. So one question that you hear a lot is like, is there a trade-off between protecting the environment and economic development, right? Like there's always this tension, for instance, with the Clean Water Act that I'm familiar with, right? Like, because, you know, anytime you build a subdivision, it pollutes the water, right? Because you're taking plants off the landscape, you're clearing land. And so how strict is the Clean Water Act on how you can develop and how you can't? So there's always sort of this tension between economic development and protecting the environment. And you'll often hear folks say like, well, you know, we can either protect the environment or we can develop economically. And one thing I'm hoping is that our conversation up to now has shown you that that's kind of a more complex conversation than people make it sound, right? We do have these non-market values that we need to be thinking of, but that there are certainly economic activities that don't necessarily harm the environment. So a couple things to keep in mind is that the answer to this question, I'm one of those people who was like, college shouldn't teach you what to think, it should teach you like how to think. So I'm not going to like give you an answer here. You can answer this question in your own head over the course of the semester. But there's a couple perspectives that are important. The first is whether we think long-term versus short-term. So in almost all cases, when we look at the short-term economic benefit versus environmental cost, right? Very often, extractive policies make sense in the short term. So going and getting as many resources as we can now makes sense in the short term. Because if I go and I cut all these trees this year, that's a lot of resources for me. But if I cut all these trees this year, how many trees can I cut next year? 0. How many trees can I cut the year after that? 0. Maybe 10 years, more likely 20 years from now, I can start to harvest a few of those trees. Meanwhile, when I've clear cut this whole area, as you can imagine, there's a pretty big environmental impact to that. When we get a rainstorm here now, it's going to wash away the topsoil, right? Our habitat for species has gone away. So when we look at what's going to benefit us most in this next year, we're probably going to say, let's cut down all those trees right now. But if we step back and say, what's going to benefit us the most over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, then we think about doing things in a more sustainable manner that's going to keep the soil's ability to grow trees. Because if I cut all these trees and a big storm comes through and washes the soil away, is that land going to be able to grow trees next year? It's not going to, right? So one question to keep in mind when we're weighing kind of economic development versus environmental protection is, are we asking what's going to give us the most benefits this year or what's going to benefit us the most 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, 20, 30 years down the road. Of course, the problem is that very often folks that are elected to positions to decide on these things are often not there for 10, 20, 30 years, right? So because of that, that's kind of a challenge with our kind of the timing of what this is. Another thing that we want to look at is how many people benefit. So very often, the folks that are benefiting most at the grassroots are lower income, especially when we look across the world, at the global south, for instance. A lot of the subsistence farming that goes on, those are folks that are among the world's poorer people. This is a stat that blew me away. I think this was last year when I found this. That, think of the poorest half of the world's population. What are we at, about 8 billion people on the planet? Is that about what it is? Something like that, almost. So you take the poorest 4 billion people on the planet, and you total up all of their wealth. The richest 8 people on the planet have the same amount of wealth. Which, mind blown, right? Pretty crazy. So when we think about resource extraction, again, and our conversation about the amount of agency and wealth and privilege of the people in these places where the extraction is taking place, right? These are generally not the wealthiest, most empowered people in society. They're not the poorest 50%, right? Sorry. Where the extraction is taking place, that is the poorest 50% for sure. So when we look, and when we, again, saying that we're clear-cutting a forest in the tropics, that forest all of a sudden is not able to supply the clean water that it was before, nutrient cycling, the trees, all sorts of things. So it also, the answer to this question depends on whether we think of lots of people benefiting or fewer people benefiting. And then, I have another stat in here. I may not have included it. I did not. Some of y'all might remember the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Gosh, is it 2010 now? I don't even want to know. I don't want to know how old you guys were 10 years ago. You were hanging out with your Cabbage Patch Kids. So this is this massive oil spill, and it cost tens of billions of dollars to clean that up. And that oil spill, the damage in 1 year was over 10 times the amount of money that was generated by the local fishing economy. So what that means is that one big environmental disaster has a cost that is much more than what that environment was producing. So when we do have damage to the environment, it's on a massive scale, whereas we would have made up that money eventually if we had just allowed those kind of local economies based on the natural resources. All right, this is a quote from the Sierra Club. It says, "Our children cannot continue to bear the brunt of pollution while others cash in at our expense. We need to invest in more recycling, more compost, cleaner, safer, and provide more jobs for our community." We'll talk about this piece later, but one thing we're learning now is that as we start transitioning to more green and environmentally friendly economies, we're seeing more jobs. We're seeing more jobs. It takes a lot more people to install solar panels on roofs than it does to operate a massive machine that mines coal in West Virginia. We're learning that this green economy is producing more jobs than the way that we've traditionally done things as well. So these are all important things to keep in mind. All right. So, I'll just touch on chapter 7, then we'll come back to this next class. So, one of the points that I hope like we were able to make from that discussion of economics is that neoclassical economics does not necessarily value the environment, right? And so if we don't have an environmental policy in place, then the environment is likely to be undervalued and disproportionately damaged. So chapter 7 delves into environmental policy. Here's a definition for policy just because I have to give you one. And I have a nice picture of a snowy mountain next to it to make you feel better. How about that? So as you're memorizing this, you can just, look at that nice snowy mountain. So the idea then is that a policy is a set of plans and principles to address problems and guide decisions. So that once we get a policy into place, we're not going to have to keep rethinking things over and over. It's going to be a guide that we can continue to go back to. And so I think, okay. We're going to wait because I think I'm going to do that on the whiteboard, and it's kind of a long example. Let's go ahead and wrap things up there, and then we'll come back in the articles that we were going to discuss today. Let's put those off till Monday, and I'll send a reminder about that. I'll keep working on the text. Any issues that you're having still, please email me, and I apologize once again. I'll try to get that set up. And I don't know, go outside and enjoy some of those non-market values of nature. The beauty, the fresh air, the birds, the butterflies, the black bears that might run across campus, it's all there.